Good evening. Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm thrilled to welcome all of you here to the library tonight and to welcome all of you who are joining us online. It's January here in Boston, it's cold and dark, and all of you still made it out to Columbia Point to participate in the civic life of our country. Let's start with a round of applause for that. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Kennedy Library Forum series, and I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters, lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. Tonight's program is also supported in part by the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation. Thank you, Jim and Kathy, for being champions of the Kennedy Library and our work. Before we begin, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand was once stewarded by Indigenous peoples. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Also, our guest tonight, David Rubenstein, has kindly agreed to sign copies of his new book, The Highest Calling: Conversations on the American Presidency, after the program. Our bookstore is selling copies of the book if you're interested in purchasing one on site. Now, I'm so pleased that Stephen Kennedy Smith is here with us tonight to introduce our speakers. Stephen is President Kennedy's nephew, the son of Ambassador Gene Kennedy Smith and Stephen E. Smith, for whom this room, the Stephen E. Smith Center, is named. He is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and a member of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation's Board of Directors. He's been a great friend and mentor to me, and I'm so thrilled that he could join us tonight. Thank you, Stephen.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and on behalf of my cousin Caroline Kennedy, who sends her best tonight, and the whole Kennedy family, welcome and thank you for coming. And thank you, David Rubenstein, who is a beloved and admired family friend, for coming to the library. It means a lot to us. President Kennedy loved history. In fact, he was a historian himself, and he wrote an article on John Adams for the American Historical Review, which is little known, but I'm sure David Rubenstein knows about it. But he also loved poetry. And in fact, when he was asked what books he would take to a desert island, he said the Bible and the Oxford Anthology of English Verse. So I thought I would start tonight by reading a short Zen poem that I don't think he knew, but I think he might have liked. And it goes like this. It's about the night sky, which you can see when this curtain is drawn behind you, a beautiful view of the Boston night sky. 10,000 stars, one radiance, a clear and boundless sky. All the world is bathed in darkness. Throughout the world, nothing but light. Where do we find ourselves? May we brightly shine the light of our essential nature, illuminating all that might shake our faith in the deep and essential goodness of the human heart. President Kennedy was a war veteran who was certainly not blind to the human capacity for evil. In fact, he described himself as an idealist without illusions. But he also believed in the capability of individuals or a society to choose to do the right thing. A man may die, a nation may rise and fall, but an idea lives on. The idea that societies and individuals can choose what is good, what is wise, what is courageous, even in dark moments, sometimes even at great personal cost. That idea is what this library is dedicated to. It's why we give the Profiles in Courage Award, to celebrate human courage, whether it be Republican or Democratic. When President Kennedy stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," when Robert Kennedy's plane departing South Africa, flew over Robben Island and dipped its wings to Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela came to this library to thank our family, when Václav Havel, the leader of the Velvet Revolution that overthrew communism in Czechoslovakia, came to this library, they were affirming the principles that this library stands for, that when something bad is happening, something good is also happening, that only a society built on moral principles can endure, and that the one thing we must never lose is hope. And as Václav Havel said, hope is not the conviction that things will turn out well. Hope is a conviction that what you're doing makes sense, no matter how things turn out. I once asked the famous Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and biographer of Lyndon Johnson, Bob Caro, what was the most important responsibility of a president? And he said without pausing, the president's most important duty is educator-in-chief. He sets the moral and psychological tone for the nation. And that is why I think it's appropriate to have David Rubenstein here tonight to talk about leadership and presidential leadership. David Rubenstein himself is a leader and a force for good in America, especially for his work in helping to preserve our shared history and illuminate our best principles. And at a moment when we are enmeshed in tribalism, he has dedicated himself to trying to strengthen our civic culture and understanding of our shared history. And the things that his biography is very long, and I'll read it to you in a minute, but what I know about personally is just that David Rubenstein helped to preserve the Washington Monument. David Rubenstein purchased one of the only copies of the Emancipation Proclamation and donated it to the National Archives. David Rubenstein, I just learned tonight, purchased a copy of President Kennedy's 1956 Harvard commencement speech and donated it to Harvard. And the list goes on. There's all kinds of things that he does that he doesn't talk about. So we're so honored. And he is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is also has one of the rarest qualities that you will find in a billionaire, which is humility, wit, and a sense of humor. And so we're just so honored and thrilled that you're here, David. I'll just finish by saying some of his other awards. He's taken the Giving Pledge to give the majority of his fortune away. He's been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Biden, and he also has 2 television shows, one on PBS and one on Bloomberg. The last thing I'll say, David, is Caroline asked me to send you a special message that if President Kennedy were alive today, he'd surely be watching your TV show. I also would like to introduce our moderator tonight, a member of our board, Christine Heenan, whose accomplishments are almost as much as David. She is the Chief Communications Officer and Executive Partner at Flagship Pioneering. She's advised the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Whitehead Institute, the Rockefeller Family Office, has also taught at Harvard, as well as been involved in a number of nonprofit charity efforts that are highly commendable. A couple of months ago, I introduced the pianist for the Rolling Stones, and he was the pianist for the Rolling Stones, the Allman Brothers, Little Richard, Bonnie Raitt, the Black Keys, and I would say that these people are the only 2 people I know who have better resume than Chuck Leavell. So without further ado, we'll start our program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, and welcome to our audience, both here at the John F. Kennedy Library and also online. David, Stephen has just described many of your accomplishments, but we're here tonight to talk about your latest book, The Highest Calling, which takes us from the first president of the United States to the 47th. We're here in the library that celebrates the life of the 35th. Throughout this book, you are the interviewer. You interview both former presidents, every former living president in this book, current former living president, and many presidential historians. But tonight, you are the answerer, not the asker. So we're counting on some of that encyclopedic knowledge and some of that wit that Stephen talked about to come through. I want to start, we were talking backstage about having both been serving in Democratic White Houses and the Domestic Policy Council staff in our mid-20s. And you worked for President Carter. It was a high contrast in early January as we were ushering in a new administration, a returning president, and laying President Carter to rest. And many people here, I'm sure, watched the funeral or some of the excerpts. Were you at the funeral?
I was there, yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, it was a surreal kind of situation because when Carter came to Washington the first time, he was a conquering hero. He had beaten the Nixon kind of administration, though he really beat Gerald Ford, but he was a breath of fresh air and everybody welcomed him. But then he had a very tough 4 years. He wanted to do so many things, and the Congress, controlled by Democrats, couldn't do everything he wanted. He tended to be more moderate than the liberal wing of the Democratic Party that he had defeated for the nomination initially. And so he struggled a bit, and then you had the problems of inflation, gas lines, and the ultimate problem, the Iran hostage situation. So he left in, I won't say disgrace, but he was, I won't say clinically depressed, I'm not a doctor, but he and his wife just couldn't believe what happened to him. He lost 489 votes to 49 electoral votes. He went back to Plains and found out that he was almost broke because his peanut warehouse had been mismanaged a bit, and he had to struggle to avoid it going bankrupt, and then he had to rebuild his life. And he was only, when he left the White House, he was only 56 years old. We'd love to have a president 56 years old these days, right?
That's young, 56.
Right. But then he spent the next 44 years, I won't say atoning for anything, because he didn't think he had done anything wrong, but kind of rebuilding his reputation. And so when he came back to Washington, it was unusual. He had come as a hero. He had left as a goat, in effect, because people thought he had humiliated the Democratic Party, lost so badly, and then he came back as a hero again. And it's really because he was an ex-president 11 times longer than he was president. And in that 11 times, he did things that won the Nobel Peace Prize, among other things, eliminated guinea worm, river blindness, other kinds of diseases that no one else really was willing to tackle, built the Habitat for Humanity homes that everybody's probably familiar with. And by the way, I asked him once, I said, Mr. President, now, would somebody really want to live in one of these homes? Because you got these amateurs going like this, and they really know what they're doing. He said, David, let me tell you the secret. These are amateurs, so they're afraid the houses aren't going to be that strong. So instead of putting one nail in, they put 10 in every time they need one. So the houses are much stronger. Carter had an unusual, marriage in the sense that he was married 77 years. 77 years, and he almost came divorced once. He told me he and his wife were supposed to write a book together, and they couldn't agree on it, and it was supposed to be a joint book, and they argued so much they almost thought they were going to get divorced. Finally, they gave the money back to the publisher, and each wrote their own books. But other than that, it was a true love story, 77 years of marriage. And he held on to 100 years. It was an impressive person. I was here when he dedicated this building. He came up and made a famous effort to kiss Mrs. Kennedy, which she wasn't as receptive to as he might have been. And so, but I was here when it opened in 1979 it was.
Is there a comparable post-presidency to the Carter post-presidency?
Well, there are a number.
Live longer now.
Well, you could say there are a couple. Most successful, you could argue, was Grover Cleveland got back and got elected president again. But in terms of doing things non-presidential, I think Teddy Roosevelt did a fair number of things after he left. But most presidents, when they leave, they don't live that long. You live 44 years. That's a long time to live. I think we don't have a system in our country where we don't really have a constitutional role for former presidents, but we kind of expect them to do things, and now we expect them to raise the money themselves for the libraries and so forth and so on. I think a lot of people have done good things. Bill Clinton, the person for whom you worked, has done pretty good things with his foundation, and he's been very active. I think a lot of presidents have done good things, and I wish the presidents would get together more and kind of speak with a combined voice, because if you can get the former presidents to speak together with a combined voice, given the fact we're Democrats and Republicans, they would maybe have some influence on public policy and for the good.
I want to talk about the combined voice or the notion of joint forces and cue a photo from the funeral of President Ford's son delivering a eulogy on behalf of his father, a promise that had been made between the two presidents.
Right.
And when you hear about that, and when you hear about it through Gerald Ford's words, tell me, do you hold out hope that there can be that kind of camaraderie post-presidency between a Democratic and Republican president who ran against one another?
Yeah, let me explain what happened. Of course, when you live to be 100, you outlive most of your enemies and your friends, too. The system we have in the United States is that when you're elected president of the United States, within a relatively short period of time, you begin to plan your funeral. And so if a president dies in office, they have it all mapped out. And if you die after you leave office, it's all mapped out. So Carter had 44 years after he left the presidency to change his funeral, and did it, many different times. He made some changes in it. Gerald, he outlived two people that he had asked to give obituaries, Walter Mondale and his former vice president, and Gerald Ford. The Gerald Ford situation was very unusual. Carter didn't know Ford from anything because he had never been in Washington, really. If he met Ford before, it was maybe just at a governor's event at the White House. We didn't really know him. And then they ran against each other. And in the end, I think Ford had a really good chance of winning that election because Carter was coming from nowhere. Southerner, when being a Southerner, it was thought to be not a great thing to be a presidential candidate for. And Gerald Ford's voice broke in the last couple days of the campaign. He couldn't speak very much because he was hoarse, and he came this close to winning.
Yeah.
And so
I learned from your book that they think if the election were a week later, Ford would have carried.
Absolutely. And Carter didn't win by that much. So what happened was they went their separate ways, and they didn't really, you have the usual thing. You go to the White House, you say hello to the president, and then you get some ideas from him, but then you really don't have any real relationship with him. And then what happened was when Sadat was assassinated, the president was Reagan, and Reagan asked the living presidents to go to represent him. And it was Ford, Nixon, and Carter, three of whom really didn't get along so well. Nixon and Ford had their own problems. Carter and Ford they'd run against each other. They didn't really know each other that well. And then the president also sent Al Haig on that plane. Al Haig took in fact, the only bedroom on the plane because he was Secretary of State, and he made the
Good
other
foreshadowing.
The four of them presidents had to stay in the staff area, and then they slept on the floor. It was awkward. And then Ford and Carter started talking to each other on the way over, and they realized they had some things in common. Then on the way back, Nixon peeled off and did something in Europe. So it was really just Ford and Carter, and Mrs. Carter was there as well. And they really bonded, and they agreed to kind of work on things together, and they began to do election reform together, and they really had a really good relationship. I think the Republicans weren't that happy with it because they thought Carter was getting stuff for Ford to do that Ford shouldn't have done as a Republican. But whatever the case, they did have a very good relationship.
Before we leave President Carter, we found this great photo of you and the president you worked for at 27 years old.
Okay, so let me tell you what that is.
All right.
You'll notice when you look at athletes, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio from the earlier days, you notice how thin they are compared to people today? Look at Carter. I mean, Carter is really thin, and I wasn't quite as thin. But here's what happened. I didn't expect we would lose the election. And so I just thought, when you work in the White House, you have a view that you know more than anybody else because the best information comes in the White House, you're making the best decisions. All White Houses are like that. And so you have a process of thinking that you're going to win despite what people tell you. Think you know more. So we thought we were going to win, and we thought the hostages were going to come out, and that would be euphoric for Carter, and we'd win. Okay. So I didn't pay attention to all the photos you get in the White House. You get photographers taking pictures all the time. I never went to the photo shop to ever get my photos back. And so, after we lost the election, I said, wait a second, I have no photos with me and Carter. And so I said to the staff people, well, maybe I can get a photo with Carter myself, something I'd have one photo. And so it got postponed. So this is on January the 19th.
Oh, gosh.
Carter is trying to get the hostages out, and the scheduled appointment for me to show up. And there, he was very polite about it. And there I am just saying, thanks very much. And that's my hair was darker then, I would say.
So this is one of your last days in the White House. But
January 19th, Carter was trying to get the hostages out. You
tell a pretty good story about your first day in the White House. You didn't really know where you were going.
So what happened on the very first day in the White House, I was involved in the White House transition. And we went over to see the man who was in charge of the White House for Gerald Ford. His name was Dick Cheney, and he was 34 years old. And I said to myself, this guy's got no career ahead of him because he's 34 years old, he's lost the presidency, he's a White House staff guy, what's he going to do? Okay, so he said to me, at the end of the meeting, he said, look, let me tell you something. We're not coming in on January the 20th. So if there's an emergency, a tornado or something happens, somebody should be here to answer the phones and say something. I can't come in before noon, but at noon, we're not coming here. And what happens is you guys go up to the Capitol, you're in the inauguration, you're not going to be down here for a couple hours. So between the hours of 12 and 2 or 3, make sure you have somebody here. There's not going to be anybody here. So I went back and told Carter this, and they said, well, we're going up the inauguration, and we're going to the parade. You go into the White House. So, okay, I'll miss the inauguration. So I walked across from Blair House to on January 20th at about 12 o'clock. And
across Pennsylvania Avenue to the gate.
Right across the street. And I said to the White House staff people, the White House guards, here, I'm David Rubenstein for the new administration. They said, well, where's your clearance? Well, what do you mean clearance? I don't know. I don't have any clearance. And it took me 2 hours to talk my way in. And so I finally convinced them that I was legitimate. I get in there walking around looking for a crisis I could solve, but there was no crisis. And then I just went down to the mess to have some lunch. And it turned out that their specialty was the Tex-Mex food they had that day, and so that was I didn't do anything the first day, but Carter, as you may remember, walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, which had been planned in advance, but they didn't want to let anybody know about it for security reasons. In those days, the White House was much different in the sense that there were no metal detectors. If you worked in the White House, you could just walk in. Even if you're a guest, you just have clearance, but there were no metal detectors, they just didn't have anything like that then. It was just, in hindsight, you could have taken a bazooka into the Roosevelt room, set it up, and shot it, and nobody would have been able to stop you. It just was bizarre when you think about it.
2 days after this, President Reagan was standing where you guys are standing here, and he was there for 8 years,
right,
followed by George Herbert Walker Bush, who you knew pretty well through your time at Carlyle. President Reagan has been viewed as the standard bearer of the Republican Party, the president. He's enjoying a renaissance with the Max Boot book recently. Right. People would be surprised to learn that his sort of role model for the presidency was actually a Democrat, was FDR.
FDR. Well, he had been a Democrat in those days.
But he really admired him, particularly as a communicator. And you have an interview with an FDR historian in the book. And you talk about, with Jonathan Darman, he said that he was motivated to write this book about FDR because he was really interested in how presidents can bring hope to a nation. Stephen spoke about hope a minute ago. I was really struck by something he told you that FDR accomplished: 2 things. 1, he convinced people the future was going to be okay. And 2, that together we can do big things. Do you think people can be convinced of those 2 things again?
Well, it was a different era at that time. The country was really in crisis. We had a banking crisis, financial crisis. There were Hoovervilles, as they called them, because there were people who were basically had lost their houses, and they were living in tents in Washington, D.C. area. It was not very good. And when Roosevelt came in, Hoover wanted to envelop Roosevelt into his plans about what Hoover thought should be done, and he wanted to not wait till Roosevelt took over. In those days, the election was in November, but the inauguration was not until March the 4th. So you had a long period of time, and Hoover wanted to do certain things, and Roosevelt didn't want anything to do with Hoover because he didn't want to be blamed for anything Hoover thought up. So there was a very bad relationship, and when they drove down Pennsylvania Avenue that day, they didn't talk to each other. This administration, at least they did talk to each other. Biden and Trump did have a pretty lively conversation, I understand, from somebody who was in the car. So I'd say that the point you're referring to is Jonathan Darman is the son of Richard Darman, who worked in my firm, and he was a Harvard graduate and a big admirer of John Kennedy, even though he ultimately became a Republican. What Jonathan Darman said was that when Roosevelt came down with polio, it changed his life because Roosevelt had been considered an effete, non-intellectual, and not all that gifted a leader, and was not taken seriously by any of his peers. And then when he came down with polio, after he had maybe gone to a Boy Scout jamboree, maybe caught it there, his legs couldn't move, and he didn't know what it was for a month. He stayed up in Campobello, and he's paralyzed. His legs aren't moving, but they don't know exactly what it was. Had he had better doctors...
It was misdiagnosed, right?
It was misdiagnosed. Yeah. Had they had better doctors, they might have been able to save him his ability to walk. He never could walk again. But the theory behind Darman's book is that by having polio and having to learn how to get around, how to remake himself. It gave him the grit and the determination, the perseverance that made him become a very effective president.
What I was surprised to learn in your book that it was that when he was on crutches running for governor of New York, that was very open. In fact, the New York Post wrote about, we've just elected a governor who's on crutches, and yet it was something that he took great pains during the presidency to shield from his public image.
He always wanted people to believe that he could walk a bit. In other words, he never recovered the use of his legs, never. They would withered and it never worked again. But he had a way of walking, often with his son James, where he would swivel his hips a bit, and it gave the appearance that he was walking with some assistance. But he didn't really like to be photographed in a wheelchair, and I think there's only one photograph of him in a wheelchair from the time he was in the White House. The reporters in those days were different than today. They had a silent agreement. We won't show him in the wheelchair. People didn't know that he had polio, but he hid from the public exactly how weak he was physically. That wasn't quite known.
The profile of President Kennedy in your book talks about him having ailments his entire life, talks about Richard Nixon accusing him of having Addison's disease.
Yes.
It made me think about all of the recent pressure and accusations around President Biden and the aides around him shielding his own decline. What changed? Why is that? Haven't presidents always wanted to project an image of virility and strength and health regardless of the actual facts?
Well, nobody wants to project an image of weakness, of course. And presidents, it's interesting that we have some gaps in our system. No president is required to release their income tax returns. And in fact, in the most recent campaign, nobody even asked Trump about it because I guess they figured he wasn't going to release it. And so, but there is no requirement that you release information about your health either. Presidents have usually released a letter from their doctor saying they're Charles Atlas or something like that, but there's no requirement. And I think it would be a good idea, and I said in the book, it would be a good idea if we had some requirement that presidents or presidential candidates give independent doctors some ability to assess their health.
A 50-yard dash after a debate or weightlifting or...
Well, anything better than, for example, in President Kennedy's case, he did have Addison's disease. Yeah. Addison's disease was then a fatal disease. It's your adrenaline glands basically wither away and you will die. He had medication for it, but I think he said in talking with some of his friends, he didn't think he would live to a long life because he had Addison's disease, but he denied it and it was denied. And now I think people kind of recognize it was true. When President Trump was running the first time, he had his doctor send a letter that turns out his doctor said that Trump dictated, saying he'd be the strongest man who ever been president of the United States. So in Biden's case, I think Joe Biden, who I've known for a long time, and because he was the first senator who endorsed Jimmy Carter, and I've known him from the time pretty much.
Were you a staffer in the Senate? Was he?
I was in the Senate. I worked briefly in the Senate for Senator Birch Bayh, and he was a senator then. I did get to know him then, and I knew him for a long time, and I would say that, I analogize it this way. Clearly, he was not the same person he was, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But if any of you, let's suppose you have a parent or a grandparent, and you see them once every 6 months. When you see them, you say, geez, they've barely aged. And then, of course, you realize they might be looking at you and saying, you really aged. But when you see somebody every single day at work, you kind of may recognize that maybe they're not quite as good as they were a while ago, but it doesn't hit you like a ton of bricks how much they have aged. And I think a lot of the people around him, they had accepted the fact that he was slowing down a bit, but they didn't think that he had slowed down so much so that he couldn't be elected again. They did believe that, and to this day, Joe Biden is convinced that he would have won. And think about it, Kamala Harris, had she gotten 230,000 more votes in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, 230,000 in those 3 states, she would have won. So with putting a campaign together with 102 days, she had been vice president but not seen as a strong potential commander-in-chief, and with not a lot of support from President Biden and some of the people around Biden, she managed to get reasonably close to some extent. Had Biden run, it might have come out differently, and he made one fatal mistake in the campaign. And it was, I don't know who the staff person is that recommended it to him, but somebody said to him, why don't you challenge Donald Trump to an early debate? Now, had there been no early debate, I think Biden would have been the nominee. And had there been no debate at all, he might have won, because if I were advising Joe Biden at the time, I'd say, look what happened the first time you debated Donald Trump. He interrupted you a lot. You can say, I don't want to do this again. I'm not going to have that interruption. I'm not going to debate. And he might have gone through without a debate. So it's not impossible to think that he could have won that election. Whether he could have lived to 86 and been sound and all that, that's what he said, he doesn't know. But that was the biggest mistake he made in the campaign, was agreeing to a debate early.
If you think about it, had he not debated, the last widespread image of him would have been the State of the Union address, when he actually surprised a number of people with how strong and how spry he seemed.
No, look, and we all have our good days and bad days. I would say that all presidents do a reasonably good job on their State of the Union because they do practice it, and they're reading from a teleprompter. As you may remember, Bill Clinton one time went to give the State of the Union address, and the wrong speech went up on the teleprompter. And so he's seeing a speech like the Gettysburg Address is on the teleprompter, and I can't be reading that. And so he kind of winged it for a while before somebody finally got the right speech in there. So I would say if he'd given that State of the Union, had not debated, it could have been different. And I'm not a doctor. I can't assess his mental abilities and so forth, and I don't know whether he has any neurological problems. Obviously, he's an 82-year-old man and about to be 83, and some people who are 82 and 83 are sharp as a tack. Warren Buffett, when he's 82 and 83, sharp as a tack. Some people are not. People age differently, but I do think that was probably the biggest mistake that was made in the campaign in hindsight.
In the particular case of the joint session address on health care in September of 1993, when President Clinton had the wrong speech loaded, for those of us who were involved in that speech, he was changing the speech in the motorcade right up to the last second, which is why the budget address was what had last been in there. It was a really harrowing thing to live through. Let's talk about My Former Boss. The interview that you do with President Clinton in the book is unique in an important respect. It's an interview with two people. The president and the first lady, Senator of New York, Secretary of State, two for the price of one, as they might say and did say in the 1992 campaign. Talk about the decision to interview them together.
Well, mostly they don't like to do events like that together. I think they both think that they have a lot to say by themselves, and then interrupting each other, it's a little awkward. So interrupting, it's complicated. So they don't usually do that, and you probably know better than I do. They usually don't do that. I had...
it's very rare.
So they agreed to do it, and we did it at the 92nd Street Y in New York, as I recall. And, they're both respectful of each other, and I thought it was a good interview.
It's a great interview.
Bill Clinton is a person who obviously really, really smart politically, and his ability to connect the dots of various public policy is probably unrivaled of anybody I've ever met. He just knows a lot about public policy and gives fairly detailed answers. Hillary Clinton is not as much of a policy wonk, but extremely smart and much more, I think, strategic in the way she discusses things. So I thought it was a pretty good interview. And Bill Clinton, I think would have gone down in history as one of our most successful presidents. The impeachment things, the things that led to the impeachment obviously tarnished the image. But think about this. He balanced the budget or had a surplus in 3 out of the last 4 years he was president. I try to remind people, a balanced budget is when you actually have as much revenue coming in as going out. That's a rare thing. And we now have $36 trillion of debt, $36 trillion. And but he balanced the last 3 out of the last 4 years, and I think he had some pretty impressive things that he did.
I hadn't appreciated till your book. That was actually inconvenient for the Fed. The idea that we were actually not spending as much as we were taking in. He was going to screw up interest rates. It's
very, very rare to have this. And, we've had debt. Since this country started, we've had debt. When the country first started, some of you may remember if you saw the Hamilton play, but this is essentially right, that $70 million was still owed by the northern states to European creditors. The southern states had paid off their debt. And so Alexander Hamilton, wanting to establish the credit of the U.S. government, said, we have to pay off this debt. And the southern members of Congress said, wait a second, we already paid off our debt. That's the northern states' debt. They should pay it off. We're not going to make the federal debt. Ultimately, there was a dinner in Lower Manhattan, which was the capital of the United States, then Manhattan, New York. And then James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson agreed that the northern states' debt would be paid off by the federal government, in effect the southern states participating in it, in return for moving the capital to a southern area. And George Washington was given the responsibility of finding a place, and he picked a place near his home, Potomac area, Potomac River, and that's how we got Washington, D.C. there.
And you saw the Hamilton play, I assume.
Yes.
What did you think of it when you first saw it? As someone who knows as much about those founding fathers as anyone. Did you enjoy it? Could you follow the raps? Could you?
I'm not a rapper myself, but I would say that the amazing thing about it is the man who wrote that book, Ron Chernow, wrote a book on George Washington, won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a spectacular book. And it's hard to win a Pulitzer Prize on a George Washington book because there's been so many of them written. He wrote the book on Alexander Hamilton, and it didn't win the Pulitzer Prize, but it turned out that Lin-Manuel happened to pick it up and was going to Mexico on a vacation, read it. And I'm thinking up in heaven, George Washington saying, hey, a second, Alexander Hamilton has got a play about him. I'm more famous than him. He worked for me. How come there's no play about me? But there isn't. I thought the play was well done. Today, the play will seem in this atmosphere as politically incorrect because he had people playing it who were, let's say they were not all white men who were playing those parts. And today, in the atmosphere we live in, I don't know whether that play would be quite as well received, and though the play is still going on in New York and other places. But it was well done, and it's one of these things where when you write something like that, that is so clever, so well done, you kind of wonder, can you ever do something like that again the rest of your life? So, for example, and Lin-Manuel may, but topping that may be hard. Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind and basically got the inability to write anything after that because when you write Gone with the Wind, how are you going to top that? The woman that wrote To Kill a Mockingbird during her life, right? She never actually wrote another book. A book came out that maybe she did write, and probably did, but it wasn't published in her lifetime. Ralph Ellison wrote The Invisible Man and never really wrote another book after that. So when you write a great thing, as Lin-Manuel did, you have to wonder, do you get writer's block and you say, I can't replicate anything like that, I can't be as successful, and you don't write again?
I'm going to tie your point about questions of authorship to Lin-Manuel Miranda and your first profile in here, George Washington, and the farewell address, which gets good airtime in the play Hamilton. Who wrote George Washington's farewell address?
Well, George Washington he didn't want to be president of the United States. No male member.
Kept trying to quit, right? Trying to quit.
He tried to quit, but he originally, when it came to him and said, we want you to be president of the United States, he said, no male member of my family has lived past the age of 50. I'm now 56, 57. So I don't think it's a good thing, but they talked him into it, and he got elected unanimously. And in those days, he was sworn in New York, and there was no tradition. There was no, in the Constitution, you are supposed to take an oath to the Constitution, which is very novel. In other countries, you feel that if you give an oath, it's usually to the king or to God or to something, a government or the country. But this was very unique. They wrote it into the Constitution. These are the exact words you're supposed to give, and you're giving an oath to the Constitution. But you may remember when Obama was sworn in, the Chief Justice didn't get the words right, and so Obama didn't quite say the oath as in the Constitution. They had a do-over the next day. This time, Trump got the words right, but he forgot to put his hands on the Bible. So it's not required in the Constitution to have your hands on the Bible. So anyway, there is no requirement, though, that there be an inaugural address. That's a tradition that Washington started, and there's obviously no requirement that there be a farewell address. Washington hated the job of being president, so he wanted to resign after the first term was over. He actually wanted to resign for a couple months. But after the first term, he said, I'm done. I'm getting out of here. And he had Madison write a speech for him to give that was a farewell address. And then ultimately, Madison and Hamilton talked Washington out of that, and Washington stayed, elected unanimously a second term. The second time, he could have run a third term. There was no limit in those days to how much you could serve, but he eventually decided he didn't want to be president again. He'd had it, and so he asked Hamilton to take the address that Madison had once written and fine-tune it a bit. Of course, Hamilton rejected almost everything Madison did and wrote his own farewell address for Washington, but Washington never delivered the famous farewell address. Was never delivered. It was published in a newspaper. That's it. And he never actually gave it physically, but that was the farewell address, and it became famous because he had said avoid entangling alliances and avoid political parties and so forth. And it was famous, but it didn't actually ever get delivered by him.
From farewell addresses to inaugural addresses, we were talking upstairs about President Kennedy's inaugural address, which I was stunned to learn in your book is 1,350 words. And so many of us know, are taught as school children, ask not, so much about that speech. Also a question of authorship there with Ted Sorensen, others.
Well, I worked, when I graduated from law school, I wanted to work in government, but I went to work for Ted Sorensen, who had been President Kennedy's speechwriter and is real, as Nixon called him, his intellectual blood bank. Nixon had said, if I had a Ted Sorensen working for me, I would have been President of the United States. Sorensen had an incredible ability with words that you rarely see in a speechwriter. I would say in my lifetime, the greatest presidential speechwriter is Ted Sorensen. Nobody's even close. I think Peggy Noonan is very close. She did a great job for Reagan, and she didn't know Reagan. She wrote the famous Normandy speech on the 40th anniversary of Normandy, and she had never met Reagan.
These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc.
But in the Kennedy speech, what happened was there was a dispute about whether Kennedy was not considered an intellectual giant. Fairly or not, he was not considered an intellectual giant. And so people said he was a lightweight, certainly compared to Nixon, who was thought to be more cerebral in some respects. So Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage. He would have had a hard time finding senators to be in that book today, but he wrote a book about senators and Profiles in Courage, and he was in the hospital when that book was largely written. So Drew Pearson, a gossip columnist in Washington, said that he hadn't written the book. Joe Kennedy hired Clark Clifford to kind of convince Pearson that it had been written by his son, and ultimately it was all settled. The lawsuit was dismissed, and they had a settlement. But Kennedy still had in his back of his mind, people don't think I'm smart enough and I don't write my own speeches. And in those days, presidents were somehow supposed to write their own speeches. Even FDR was trying to fell for the idea that he should write his own speech, which he really didn't write. So what happened was, the assignment was given to Ted Sorensen, who was only about 30 years old at the time, to write the inaugural address. And he was asked by Kennedy to talk to various people. One was Adlai Stevenson, another was Arthur Schlesinger, one was John Kenneth Galbraith, and a lot of people came in with ideas, but Sorensen really was in control of it. And he would give the drafts to Kennedy, and Kennedy would edit it down, because he actually had been a newspaper person. He actually was a reasonably good writer. And but Kennedy was obsessed with the idea that he wanted to be known as the guy who wrote it. So he had a very clever trick, you might say. Nothing wrong with it, I guess. And he's flying up to the inauguration about 3 days before. He's flying up from Palm Beach, and he's on the plane called the Caroline, and he asked Hugh Sidey, who was then a correspondent for Time and the White House correspondent, to come back into the cabin where Kennedy was. And he said, Hugh, I'm working on my speech. I'm not sure this is really the right thing. What do you think about it? And he handed him about 2 pages. And Hugh Sidey's saying, wait a second, this guy's going to be inaugurated in 3 days, and he's asking me what should be in the inaugural address, and he's still writing the speech. Well, it worked, because Hugh Sidey then wrote an article saying, I know Kennedy wrote that speech because I saw it in his own handwriting. What actually happened was the speech was already pretty much prepared, but Kennedy took the speech, took part of it that was already typed up, and he wrote it in his handwriting. And so when he showed it to Hugh Sidey said, oh, I saw it in his handwriting. So a little bit of a sleight of hand. But in the end, Kennedy did have a lot of input, and more than people said. He edited. There are edits that he obviously had. And it was a brilliant speech. I think the best inaugural address of the 20th century, for sure. And it was a call to arms for people to go into public service, and it inspired me to go into public service and many people in my generation. So it was a brilliant speech, and the key to the speech is this. The key to these great speeches, take the Lincoln-Gettysburg Address, Martin Luther King's speech at the Lincoln Memorial, and this speech. They have these things in common. 1, they're relatively short. 2, they never say they're going to do anything specifically. You don't say, I'm going to pass this bill or that bill. They don't really have any specifics to them. 3, they are very much looking forward to the future of what's going to happen, not looking to the past so much. And they always end with a kind of reference to God and how God is going to help us, or God is going to do this with us. And it's what they have in common. But if you look at great inaugural addresses, they are not ones that really go on very long, or they have specific bill references in there. Kennedy never talked about a specific bill. And they also tend not to use the word I. I think in the Kennedy inaugural address, I don't think the word I ever appears.
You talked about how they end, and I wasn't going to go there, but
Right.
now I am. You said you're not a rapper, so I won't give you a backbeat or anything, but you can do the end of that Kennedy
Yes.
inaugural from memory.
Yeah, Kennedy's end was really impressive. I use it a lot in speeches because you can use it for anything you want. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
Take that, Lin-Manuel. Nicely done.
But Sorensen, so it's a great way to end a speech because you can say what you are doing is God's work on earth, right? So it's kind of and Sorensen's mother once had said that it was his Unitarian upbringing that kind of made him talk in that direction. It wasn't like saying God is going to do something and therefore we should follow what God's doing. He was saying we're going to do something and it's going to be what God would like us to do.
An inaugural address we didn't hear in January was that of Kamala Harris, came close, as you said, but was not elected. An inaugural address we didn't hear in 2017 was Hillary Clinton, came close, but was not elected.
Right.
Will we have a female president of the United States in your lifetime?
How long are we going to live?
So let's say you live as long as your former boss.
I would say that we will have a female elected president, I'm sure. I don't think that Kamala Harris failed because she was a woman, and I don't think Hillary Clinton failed because she was a woman. I think it was more their ideological views that probably were further left than the electorate. But again, had she gotten 230,000 more votes, she would have won in those 3 states. I think we will have a female president for sure. The society has changed, from the time that John Kennedy was president. John Kennedy had, how many women did he have in his cabinet?
John Kennedy?
Yeah, none.
I assume 0.
The idea of having women on the court, how many women on the court by John Kennedy? None. It was a different world. So today, the world is different. So seeing a woman being a CEO, seeing a woman be a senator or governor is just not as much of a big change as it was in those days.
White House Chief of Staff, new boundary
We have
broken.
a White House Chief of Staff, sure. And in the days that Kennedy was there, if you look at the pictures of the cabinet, it was all white men. Kennedy had no blacks in his cabinet either. And he only had in his staff, he had one African-American on his staff, Lewis Martin, who later worked for Carter. And when he was working on his inaugural address, there was a line in Kennedy's inaugural address saying that we're going to support human rights abroad. And Lewis Martin lobbied very hard and against a lot of opposition to insert, we're going to have human rights at home and abroad. And at home was supposed to be a reference to civil rights. But the idea of having African Americans on your staff or women on your staff, there were no White House staff people who were women other than secretaries. You
said earlier that we're sort of maybe moving away from DEI or the idea
Right.
of being attentive to equality and representation being woke. Let's talk about President Trump for a few minutes. He seems singular in his particular approach to the presidency and in his particular approach to living and being. But my son was reminding me that Andrew Jackson, fiery populist, accused his opponent of stealing the election from him, John Quincy Adams, the ultimate establishment candidate.
Right.
Is there an archetype of the populist, firebrand, accusatory president that Trump fits into?
Well, you're right. Andrew Jackson thought that John Quincy Adams stole the presidency from him, and then ultimately he came back and won the next time. Trump is being criticized now for many things, but one of them is he's honoring his campaign promises. Now, what kind of politician honors his promises? Trump said a lot of these things in the campaign. I don't think he's coming up with a lot of things he didn't say. So, many people are not used to a president actually saying, I'm going to honor my promise. I reminded me when I was in the White House, we won the campaign. Carter said to my boss, Stuart Eisenstadt, Stuart, I want to make sure I honor my campaign promises. So I want to make sure I know what I promised. There was no internet then, and we didn't have good records. So I was supposed to go back through everything Carter had said in the time he was running for campaign and then compile his promises. And I said, geez, I don't know if you honor all your promises, is that going to make you very popular? I don't know. There are a lot of them are inconsistent with each other and so forth. But we did give it to Carter. And I did sit in a lot of meetings with Carter where I was designed to be the person who said, Mr. President, that would violate your campaign promise. So Carter wouldn't have to be the bad guy. I would be the bad guy saying, Mr. President, you can't do that to violate your promises. Trump now is honoring a lot of the promises he made. Whether they were good ideas or not, I don't know. He's been criticized by some Republicans, Lindsey Graham among others just today, saying that he wouldn't have pardoned the people who were violently involved in the January 6th events. But Trump said he was going to do that in the campaign. People didn't believe him. I didn't believe him, but it happened. So I think Trump is different, and I want to make a comment about Trump, and I do know him, and I've interviewed him in the book.
Yeah,
in fact,
you interview him in the book, and you interview Maggie Haberman about him in the book.
My experience with him was I really didn't know him at all, not in the business community. I'd never done any business with him, but what happened was my parents were blue-collar workers. They moved Baltimore when they retired at a very young age. My father was a federal worker. You could retire at 55. They moved to a suburb of Baltimore called West Palm Beach, Florida. And when they moved down there, you know, every time I had an anniversary or a wedding event or graduation or something, I would go and I would have a party down there, and I would rent a place called Mar-a-Lago, where you didn't have to be a member, you just show up with a credit card. And so I would do that, and then every time we do it, a tall guy with orange hair would come along, and he would kind of, photobomb our events. Companies got a photo. He was well-meaning, and I got to know him, and eventually, as the president of the Economic Club of Washington, I'm always looking for speakers I can interview. Somebody said, why don't you interview Donald Trump? I said, well, he's not that famous a guy. They said, no, he has a TV show called The Apprentice. I'd never seen it. And they said, okay, so I wrote him a letter. I said, remember, I'm the guy whose photo So You Always Bombed and when my family was there. And he said, I remember who you are. So he came down, and in the green room, this is 2000, and I think it's 15, he said, David, ask me any question you want, but ask me for sure if I'm going to run for president. I said, well, president what? He said, president of the United States. I said, Donald, you're not going to be president of the United States. He said, I know, but, I can do it for a couple months. We'll see how it works. But, okay, I don't think he really thought he would get there, but he might disagree.
You asked Maggie about that, whether he thought he'd actually win the first time.
I don't know if he really thought he was going to win. He also said, ask me if my hair is real. People sometimes think it's not real and pull it. And I said, I'm not comfortable doing that. So, and then he called me the next day and said, David, it's the best interview I ever had. You did a great job, and I'm going to make you an honorary member of Mar-a-Lago, which he did, but then was rescinded. And then he said, it was the highest rated show in the history of C-SPAN. So I called the president of C-SPAN and said, what were the ratings? And he said, we don't have ratings. So, but, I have gotten to know Donald Trump, and I would say in his defense, and people should think about this. When he was first elected president, he was the first president of the United States who had never had any government experience. Every president had either been in the military or in civilian part of government. He had no experience. And so all of a sudden he's elected president of the United States. I don't know if he really thought he was going to get elected or not, but he all of a sudden he has to put a government together. He doesn't know anything about government. So he hired a lot of famous people, well-meaning people who were respectable people, but he didn't think ultimately they were as loyal to him as he wanted. And he was learning the job. Now, after 4 years out of office, he's had 4 years to think about what he wants to do. He's got people that he really thinks are loyal to him, working with him. And I think he's much more astute and assured of what he wants to do than he was before. I think before he was, uncertain of what he wanted to do. Now I think he really knows what he's trying to do. He planned out the first 30, 100 days pretty well. And I think you're going to see that his plans, some of it will work and some won't work. But he's actually a person who I think is much more self-confident than he was before and doesn't have some of the insecurities I think he had the first time around.
I want to ask you about President Lincoln. I was shocked to learn from your book that there have been 16,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln.
The most books written by any American is Abraham Lincoln, by far.
So that you interview in the book Ted Whitmer, who's actually in the audience tonight, about a book I hadn't heard of, about his train trip to Washington, which was actually perilous in a way. It wasn't clear it was safe. He stopped at 70 cities. Tell us a bit about that train trip.
Well, I put that book in there. I've interviewed lots of people who are Lincoln scholars, and I've done so many interviews of them. But I put that book in because I read that book. I said, I didn't know this stuff. I'd read a lot about Lincoln, but I didn't know that Lincoln had a very circuitous route to get to Washington. One, there were assassination threats, and
couldn't go through the South, where he'd gotten no votes.
So he couldn't also go to the South. He got no votes in the South. He couldn't have a train go there, and he was afraid he'd be assassinated there. So he had a very clever idea, as Ted points out in his book. He took a circuitous route through various states, all in the North, and he'd meet famous people along the way. They came to see him, but he was not known by people. He had never been really in the East very much. He wasn't seen him, never heard him. There was no television or anything like that. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates weren't televised, and they were Senate debates anyway. So people didn't know what he looked like and so forth. And so Ted goes through in his book really interesting people that came up and met him. And one of the most interesting one was there was a girl who had written him a letter saying,
Grace Bedell.
Right, I think you would look better if you had a beard. And he actually thought about it, and he grew a beard. And then during the trip, he met the girl who had written the letter. Imagine that.
So I want to ask you about that, because you asked him about that in the book. How do you, as an interviewer, make a decision between sort of large sweeping arcs and like incredible little details like that?
Well, I think the
How do you balance
big
those?
sweeping things are people, well, may not remember that as much. People will remember an incident when you're doing an interview about the little girl, because that's a human kind of thing. So it's just, John Wilkes Booth was heard Lincoln speak during that trip. And Lincoln spoke in New York City. He spoke at Philadelphia at Independence Hall, which he'd never been to before. And then in Washington, when he came into Washington, that's where his detective, which is Mr. Pinkerton, who later founded the Pinkerton Detective Agency, he basically convinces Lincoln's people that they really should have a separate train. So when he gets to Baltimore, they switch trains, and they go on not the regular one that people would have expected him to do, but a different train. And he gets into Washington, and while people said he came in as a woman, disguised as a woman, he wasn't that, but he was wearing, I guess, a shawl and was hidden a bit in terms of his face. And he goes to the hotel, and he stays in the Willard Hotel for about 10 days because that was the safest place to stay in a hotel. And amazingly, in the speech that he gives, the inaugural address, he basically says he supports the idea of slavery. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He basically supported Buchanan, his predecessor's idea that we should have a constitutional amendment to support and reaffirm that slavery is part of the Constitution in the states where it already exists. And Lincoln obviously changed over the course of time, but that shows you how much he changed, because he was actually willing to support a new amendment to the Constitution, reaffirming slavery in the Constitution. Lincoln is, in my view, by far the greatest president we ever had, because, and maybe the greatest American we ever had, because he fought to keep the Union together when it wasn't clear that everybody in the North really wanted that to happen. A lot of people said in the South, go ahead, you want to go have your own country. And the country, I think, is better by having the country stay together, though we lost 3% of our population in the war, about 750,000 people. Second, he did free the slaves. He did it for military reasons and so forth, but he did free the slaves and ultimately made sure the 13th Amendment became the law of the land. But he did it with humility. He didn't brag, go around the White House saying, I just wrote the Gettysburg Address, aren't I great? You can't imagine that.
You have been quoted as saying if you could interview anyone, you would interview Lincoln.
Sure.
Who among the 47 presidents, if someone said, oh, good news, you get to interview Grover Cleveland or so-and-so, would you have been like, nah? Who would you have no interest in interviewing?
Who would no interest?
Among U.S. presidents?
Probably, the presidents I think were the least successful were James Buchanan, who didn't really do very much, our only unmarried president. I think Warren Harding probably wasn't one of our better presidents either. But I would say almost anybody gets to be president probably has something to say. And I get to say, and I ask that question, or I ask that because the interview format that we're now engaging in is a relatively modern phenomenon. There are no interviews of Cleopatra. There's no interviews of Julius Caesar. There are no interviews of Charlemagne. There are no interviews of Lincoln or Washington, because people didn't do that in those days. And so I would thought, with artificial intelligence, maybe we can go back and recreate what the interview would be if Lincoln was interviewed by somebody, or like if I had a chance to interview Henry VIII, I would say, why didn't you just get a prenup with your wives? Why do you have to chop
better
on
for
the head?
them as
Wouldn't
well,
a prenup
exactly.
been better?
Would have worked out better for his wives.
Yes.
All right, we are running out of time, and I have not asked you a single question about baseball.
Okay.
And when it was posted on LinkedIn or Twitter that this interview was happening, I thought, oh, people are going to say, ask him about this. Everyone wanted to ask you about the Orioles. We have a picture of you, and you're the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, but in keeping with the spirit of your book, I'm not going to ask you about the Orioles. I'm going to ask you about presidents and baseball. So this is a quiz of sorts. To test your knowledge on baseball and U.S. presidents. Are you ready?
Go ahead.
This president is credited with starting the tradition of presidents throwing out the first ceremonial pitch at baseball games, a practice that began in 1910.
So William Howard Taft?
Correct. This president was a devoted baseball fan, regularly attended games, and even monitoring standings while contending with World War I.
So Wilson?
Correct. This president famously encouraged Major League Baseball to continue as a morale booster to the nation during World War II.
FDR.
This president played semi-pro baseball in his youth.
Semi-pro baseball in his youth. Geez, let me think about that. Played semi-pro, well, George Herbert Walker Bush played at Yale, but I don't know if he played semi-pro baseball.
Well, that's not the answer anyway.
So I'm trying to think who would have played semi-pro baseball as president.
We'll come back to it. This president worked as a radio announcer of baseball games early in his career, recreating games from ticker tape.
Ronald Reagan.
Although not from Missouri, this president was a huge fan of the St. Louis Cardinals.
Huge fan of the St. Louis Cardinals. I guess not Truman.
No.
I don't know.
Recent. Bill Clinton.
Oh.
This president was part owner of the Texas Rangers before becoming
George
president.
W. Bush.
This president went to a military academy and bragged about being one of the best baseball players on the team, although there is no proof of that.
Donald John
Correct.
Trump.
Last chance. This president played semi-pro baseball in his youth and was a general during World War II.
Oh, Dwight Eisenhower.
Correct. We are going to give David, for his successful quiz, a photo of President Kennedy throwing out the first pitch.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Look, thank you very much. You obviously can have a career as an interviewer, and hope you get your own TV show.
I have a last question for you. One last question. You have long said that private equity is the highest calling.
Right.
But you named this book the highest calling, so you must think that
Well,
the presidency is also pretty high calling.
Well, I've said that private equity is the highest calling of mankind. Some people don't agree. But as I was thinking about this, I think, what is about the presidency? And I've called it the highest calling of mankind. I'm to be very serious about it. And as I say in the beginning of the book, it was first realized by Americans how important this job was when Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to resolve World War I. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in Paris were cheering him on. No president of the United States had ever been received that way. And from that time on, the president of the United States is the most powerful person in the world. Even today, the president of China is important, but nobody is important as the president of the United States, the most influential person of the 8 billion people on the face of the earth. So people want this job, and I just want to finish. Why do people want this job, though? You might say to yourself, why do people want it? John Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson driven out of office. Nixon driven out of office. Gerald Ford got reelected. Carter not reelected. Ronald Reagan almost assassinated. George Herbert Walker Bush not reelected. Why do people want to spend 2 years of their life begging people for money, eating bad food, not seeing their family, not exercising? Why do they want to do that? Because in the end, I think many Americans believe that if you are the President of the United States, you have a chance to really change the course of history, do something useful with your life, and it's worth putting up with. And so when you run for president and you don't make it, it's very, very defeating and depressing to people. And George McGovern, when he was asked, when do you recover from losing a presidential campaign, he said, never. And he said, the only thing that enables you to recover is formaldehyde, i.e. when you're dead. But I think we do, I wish we had people of the quality of we used to have. For example, when our country only had 3 million people in the beginning of the country, we had people of quality of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Now, we have lesser qualities, some people might say, than Washington, Adams, so forth. Where did the great people go that were the Washingtons today? Where are they? These people are, in my theory, they're all in private equity. But no, but we do get really talented people, and it's a tough job, and you wouldn't want to wish it on your worst enemy in many ways, because you get humiliated all the time, criticized all the time. It's a tough, tough job, and we should be thankful that we get some people who are very talented who actually want the job.
I'm going to end with a photo of what I think is one of the most inspiring things that happens here at the John F. Kennedy Library every year, which is the swearing in of new American citizens. If you have studied the presidency more than anyone I know who's alive, what would you tell new citizens of this country they should know about the Commander-in-Chief?
We have 49 million immigrants in this country. Many of them are now citizens. No other country in the world has that many immigrants coming in. They come because they believe in the American dream. And if any of you have been to any swearing-in ceremonies, they are the most emotional things you can possibly see. You have people who spent 5 years here, they passed the citizenship test, and they're people crying, their mothers are crying, or their children are crying. It's just amazing to see those, and these are done in various parts of the United States, and I really recommend people go to see a swearing-in ceremony. And a sad situation is that to be a citizen of the United States, you have to pass a citizenship test, and it's about, you get 100 potential questions, and you're asked 10 of them, and you have to get 6 correct. 91% of the people who take that test pass. The same test was given to 3.5 million Americans in this country who are native born, In only one state, Vermont, could a majority of people pass the basic citizenship test. That's because we don't teach civics anymore, we don't teach history anymore. So one of the great things about presidential libraries is they teach history and they teach civics, and I think it's an encouraging thing that more and more people are trying to learn more about this and teach more, but we still have a long way to go because, again, Americans don't know the basic facts about our government. And the theory behind representative democracy, Jefferson said, is you have an informed citizenry. To the extent that we don't have an informed citizenry, we don't have as good a government as we should have.
Well, thanks to this book and thanks to this
Thank
forum,
you.
we have a more informed citizenry. David Rubenstein, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Very good. Well done. Thank you.
Isn't that a great picture?
It's great. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Oh,
Thank you.
Standing ovation.
Thank you. Thank you.